Everyone's seen a Tiger, the silhouette, the long gun, the sloped armor that looks like it was built to laugh at whatever you throw at it. But almost no one has actually understood what it meant to face one. Not really. Not from the inside of another tank, looking through a narrow viewport at something coming toward you that your training manual hadn't prepared you for. For years, the Tiger Ein existed somewhere between legend and nightmare, a machine so feared that Allied crews began reporting Tiger sightings everywhere, even when they were looking at completely different tanks. The Germans called it Tiger phobia, and it was real. It spread through entire divisions like a disease, but here's what the history books gloss over, what the documentaries skip past in favor of slow-motion shots of a Tiger rolling through a village. There were tanks that fought back. There were crews that didn't run. There were machines built by different nations, with different philosophies, different strengths, and wildly different survival odds, that climbed into the arena with one of the most feared weapons ever put on tracks, and tried to win. Some of them had almost no chance. Some of them surprised everyone. And one of them, just one, had something close to a consistent answer. Not a guaranteed victory, not an easy fight, but a real, repeatable, documented chance of walking away from an engagement with a Tiger V, still breathing. This is every Allied tank that faced a Tiger fight. What they brought to the fight, what the Tiger brought back, and which one actually had the odds in its favor. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now, because this is the kind of breakdown that takes time to get right, and there's a lot more where this is coming from. Let's start at the beginning, not with the tanks, with the Tiger itself. Because to understand why every Allied crew had a different experience fighting it, you have to understand exactly what they were up against. The Tiger I, officially the Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger aus Vieh, entered service with the German Army in 1942. It was not a revolutionary design in the technical sense. It didn't have sloped armor. It wasn't particularly fast. It wasn't easy to maintain. In fact, it was notoriously unreliable mechanically, broke down constantly, ate through fuel, and was a logistical nightmare to transport and repair. But none of that mattered much when you were on the receiving end of it. What the Tiger I had was armor and a gun that existed in a different category from almost everything else on the battlefield at the time it was introduced. The frontal hull armor was 102 millimeters thick, set at a modest angle. The turret front was also 102 millimeters. The sides were 82 millimeters. This wasn't sloped like the Soviet T-34 that used angled plates to effectively increase protection. The Tiger's armor was just thick. Brutally, bluntly thick. And at the engagement ranges common in World War II, that thickness was enough to stop most shells fired by most Allied tanks from most directions at most distances. The gun was an 88mm KWK-36. Derived from the famous Flak 36 anti-aircraft gun, it was adapted for tank use and turned into one of the most lethal weapons of the entire war. At 1,000 meters, it could punch through 138 millimeters of armor. At 500 meters, that number climbed to 156 millimeters. The shell traveled at roughly 800 meters per second, giving it a flat trajectory and making it terrifyingly accurate at ranges that most other tanks could barely engage effectively. In practical terms, what this meant was that a Tiger I could destroy almost any Allied tank it could see. From the front, from the side, at long range, at short range, before most Allied tanks were even close enough to fire with any real hope of penetration, and the crews operating them were often experienced. Veterans of the Eastern Front who had learned to use terrain, distance, and the Tiger's firepower as a system. They didn't charge. They held ground. They picked positions. They waited. They let the Allied tanks come to them, and then they simply fired. That was the Tiger's tactical philosophy. Use the gun's range advantage. Stay at distance. Kill before being killed. And for a long time, against a lot of tanks, it worked exactly as intended. But the war didn't stay still. The Allies weren't going to keep sending the same equipment into the same losing equation forever. Different nations brought different tanks to the problem. Some earlier in the war, some later. Some by accident when their units stumbled into Tiger ambushes. Some by design, as Allied engineers and commanders tried to find an answer. Let's go through every one of them. Let's start with the tank that met the Tiger first, and had perhaps the worst odds of any Allied machine that ever tried. The M3 Lee and its cousin the M3 Grant. These were early American tanks sent to North Africa in 1942 under Lend-Lease, used by British and American forces during Operation Torch and the early fighting in Tunisia. The M3 was an unusual design. It mounted its main armament, a 75mm gun, in a hull sponson on the right side of the vehicle. This meant the gun couldn't traverse freely. The entire tank had to be turned to aim in many situations. There was also a 37mm gun in the turret, which against a Tiger was essentially decorative. The armor protection on the M3 was between 38 and 57mm on the front. Against the Tiger's 88mm gun, this was catastrophic. The Tiger could penetrate the M3's frontal armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. The M3's 75mm gun, firing standard ammunition of the time, could not reliably penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at any practical combat range. At the side, at very close range, there was a theoretical possibility, but in actual engagement, the odds were severely stacked against M3 crews. Tunisia was where the Allies first truly felt the Tiger's weight. At places like Faid Pass in February 1943, American armored units were devastated. The M3 was already being phased out in favor of the M4 Sherman, but units still equipped with it were caught in the transition. Crews described the experience of firing at Tigers and watching shells bounce off, then watching as the return fire punched through their vehicles like they were made of paper. Crews had almost no practical path to survival in a direct engagement. Their best option was withdrawal, smoke, and terrain. Not every tank crew has the luxury of being able to say their machine gave them a fighting chance. M3 crews largely couldn't say that. Next comes the tank that the Allies fielded in the greatest numbers, the one that defined the Allied armored effort, and the one that has perhaps the most complicated relationship with the Tiger I of any vehicle in history, the M4 Sherman. There are whole books written about the Sherman and the Tiger. There are arguments that still rage today about whether the Sherman was a death trap or a misunderstood workhorse. The truth, as it almost always is, sits somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. The M4 Sherman was a medium tank designed around a specific American military philosophy. Tanks were not supposed to fight other tanks. That was the job of tank destroyers. Tanks were supposed to support infantry, exploit breakthroughs, keep moving, maintain supply lines. This philosophy shaped every decision made about the Sherman, from its mechanical reliability to its production numbers to its armor and armament. The base M4 Sherman, in its most common variants during 1943 and 1944, mounted a 75mm M3 gun. This gun was excellent for infantry support. It fired a good high-explosive round, but against the Tiger I's frontal armor, it was deeply inadequate. The 75mm M3 could not reliably penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at any typical combat range. At the sides, at very close range, there was more possibility, but the geometry of most Tiger engagements, where the German crew was trying to present their front to the enemy, made side shots rare and difficult. The Sherman's armor was between 51 and 76mm on the front hull, often at relatively effective angles on the later versions, but the Tiger's 88 could penetrate it from beyond 1,500 meters on the frontal arc and further still on the sides. In addition, early Sherman variants had a wet stowage problem, ammunition stored in ways that made fire a constant risk when penetrated, earning the tank brutal nicknames from the crews that fought in it. Tommy Cooker from the Germans, Ronson from the Allied soldiers, named for a lighter with the slogan, "Lights first time, every time." And yet, the Sherman is more complicated than its failures suggest. It was mechanically reliable in ways the Tiger simply was not. It was fast, capable of sustained road speeds that the Tiger couldn't match. It was available in numbers that German industrial output couldn't compete with. And it could be upgraded. When Allied commanders and engineers recognized the gun problem, they didn't just keep sending Shermans to die. They started working on solutions. The first significant upgrade came in the form of the 76mm gun, fitted to later M4 variants beginning in 1944. The M4A1 76W, the M4A3 76W, and other variants carrying this gun represented a genuine improvement. The 76mm M1 gun could penetrate the Tiger I's frontal armor at ranges of approximately 500 to 700 meters, using standard AP ammunition. At closer ranges, penetration became more reliable. With high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition using a tungsten core, the 76mm could push effective penetration range further still, though high-VAP was often in short supply. This didn't make the 76mm Sherman a Tiger killer by default. The Tiger still had the reach advantage. The 88 still outranged the 76mm in a straight fight, but the 76mm Sherman was no longer entirely helpless. At the right range, with the right ammunition, maneuvering for a flank shot, A 76mm Sherman crew had a realistic, if still dangerous, path to winning an engagement with a Tiger I. The other critical Sherman upgrade appeared not in American hands but in British ones, and it produced something the standard Sherman couldn't offer at all. The British had a problem. Their tank designs, excellent in some ways, were falling behind the armor race against German heavy tanks. But they had access to Shermans in large numbers through Lend-Lease, and they had something America didn't have yet deployed in a tank: the Ordnance QF 17-pounder. The 17-pounder was a British anti-tank gun that had been developed specifically to deal with the increasing thickness of German armor. It fired a shell capable of penetrating 140 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters when using standard AP rounds. With the APD's armor-piercing discarding sabot round, that number climbed dramatically, making it capable of punching through Tiger I frontal armor at combat ranges that gave a crew a realistic chance of surviving long enough to set up the shot. The challenge was fitting it into a tank. The 17-pounder was a large gun, and getting it into the Sherman's turret required modifications. The British did it anyway, cutting away sections of the turret, redesigning the gun mounting, producing a variant they called the Sherman Firefly. The Firefly looked like a standard Sherman at a glance, which became both an advantage and a disadvantage. Allied crews learned to use this to their benefit, hiding Fireflies among standard Shermans, making the Germans have to identify which vehicle was the real threat. German crews and snipers learned to prioritize Firefly kills specifically because of this, and Firefly tank commanders often had their long barrel extensions camouflaged or shortened in appearance to make identification harder. In combat, the Firefly was the closest thing the Allies had to a direct answer to the Tiger I for much of 1944. It could penetrate Tiger frontal armor reliably at 1,000 meters with standard AP. With APDs, the range extended further. More importantly, the Firefly could do this from a vehicle that the enemy might initially mistake for an ordinary Sherman, which gave its crew a window of time that could mean the difference between firing first and not firing at all. The Firefly's limitations were real. It was still a modified medium tank. Its hull armor was still Sherman armor. If the Tiger got the first shot, the Firefly was just as vulnerable as any other Sherman. The turret had been modified in ways that reduced crew comfort and function, and there was never enough of them. British armored formations typically had one Firefly per troop of 4 tanks, which meant 3 standard Shermans with inadequate guns supporting one tank with a real answer. But when we talk about which Allied tank had the best chance against a Tiger I, the Firefly belongs at the center of that conversation. It was the only member of the Sherman family that could engage a Tiger from the front at reasonable combat distances with a realistic expectation of penetration. Now let's cross the channel in the other direction. Let's look at what the Soviets were doing. Because the Eastern Front was where Tigers killed in the greatest numbers, and it was also where the most intensive effort went into finding an answer. The T-34 is perhaps the most famous tank of the entire Second World War. When it appeared in 1941, it shocked German tank crews with its sloped armor and its mobility. By 1942, when the Tiger arrived on the Eastern Front, the T-34 was the backbone of Soviet armored forces, but the T-34 of 1942, mounting a 76mm gun, had serious limitations against the Tiger. The 76mm F-34 gun, the standard armament on the T-34 model 1941 and model 1943, could not reliably penetrate the Tiger I's frontal armor at normal combat ranges. At the sides and rear, at close range, there was more possibility, but frontally, at the distances at which Tiger crews preferred to engage, the T-34's gun was not enough. The T-34's armor, while brilliantly sloped at 45 to 60 degrees on the hull, was only 45 to 52 millimeters thick on the front hull. The Tiger's 88mm gun could penetrate it at extreme ranges. Some records indicate penetrations at over 1,500 meters. The disparity was serious enough that Soviet tactical doctrine for dealing with Tigers in this period emphasized mass. Don't send 1 or 2 T-34s at a Tiger. Send many. Accept losses. Use flanking attacks. Use terrain and speed to close the distance where the Tiger's long-range advantage diminishes. Use smoke. Use infantry to strip the Tiger of its supporting troops. These were real tactics born from desperate necessity. They worked, in the sense that Tigers were destroyed. But the cost was enormous, and Soviet crews and commanders knew the core problem: their gun was not enough. The answer came in 1944 with the T-34-85. This was a fundamentally upgraded T-34, featuring a new, larger turret housing the 85mm Zeiss S-53 gun. The 85mm was a significant improvement. Derived from an anti-aircraft gun in a similar fashion to the German Tiger's own 88, it could penetrate approximately 120 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. This brought it into the range where Tiger I frontal armor, at 102 millimeters, was genuinely threatened at combat distances. The T-34-85 wasn't invulnerable. The Tiger's 88 still outranged it in a straight fight, and at distances over 1,000 meters, the engagement remained favorable to the Tiger. But the T-34-85 represented a genuine upgrade in the equation. A T-34-85 crew that used terrain, moved quickly, found a flank or a closer engagement range, had a real chance. Not a comfortable chance, not an easy fight, but a real one, combined with its speed, its mechanical reliability, relative to the Tiger, and the fact that Soviet industry was producing them in numbers the Germans couldn't match. The T-34-85 became the primary answer to Tigers on the Eastern Front from 1944 onward. The numbers mattered as much as the performance. A Tiger crew that killed one T-34-85 might face 3 more before they could reload. The math of attrition was brutal, and it worked against Germany regardless of individual tank quality. There is also the Soviet heavy tank that deserves its own examination. The KV-1 was the Soviet heavy tank that predated the Tiger's appearance, and when the KV-1 was first encountered by German forces in 1941, it created its own moment of shock because early German weapons couldn't penetrate it easily. But by 1942, German guns had caught up, and the KV-1's 76mm gun faced the same limitations against the Tiger as the T-34 did. It was slower, heavier, and its armor, while thick at 75 to 90 millimeters on the front hull, was set at angles less favorable than the T-34's sloped design. The Tiger's 88 could penetrate the KV-1 at ranges out to approximately 1,500 meters on the front hull. The KV-1's gun could not reliably return the favor. The KV-1 was essentially at a disadvantage against the Tiger, slower and without the gun to compensate. Later, the KV-1S, a lightened version, reduced some of the weight and mechanical issues but kept the same inadequate gun. It was the KV-85 that finally appeared as a temporary answer, fitting an 85mm gun to the KV hull. But by the time it appeared in late 1943, it was already being supplanted by the better balanced T-34-85 and the new IS series of heavy tanks. The IS-1, mounting an 85mm gun, and the IS-2, mounting a massive 122mm D-25T gun, were Soviet responses to German heavy armor at a strategic level. The IS-2 in particular deserves attention because while it falls somewhat outside the mainstream Tiger I discussion, since both the IS-2 and the Tiger II appeared later in the war, the IS-2 did engage Tiger I tanks in combat. The 122mm gun the IS-2 carried fired a heavy shell at lower velocity than the Tiger's 88, but with devastating effect on impact. It could destroy a Tiger I at combat ranges, though its lower rate of fire, its separate loading system, requiring both shell and charge to be loaded independently, meant that in a close-quarters fight where a second shot was needed quickly, the IS-2 was at a disadvantage. At range, though, the IS-2 was genuinely lethal to Tiger-wise, and German crews reported significant respect for it. The combination of heavy armor on the IS-2, over 120 millimeters on the hull front at a significant angle, and its powerful gun made engagements with it a serious threat for Tiger crews, in ways that earlier Soviet tanks simply hadn't been. Now let's look at the British tank force before the Firefly appeared, because British armor had its own path through the Tiger problem, and it wasn't a comfortable one. The Churchill infantry tank was a slow, heavily armored British design that saw service from North Africa through Italy and into Northwest Europe. Its armor was impressive for a British tank of its time, up to 102 millimeters on the front hull on later marks, which meant the Tiger's 88mm gun faced a more serious challenge penetrating it than it did with most Allied tanks. From the front, at longer ranges, Churchill frontal armor had a chance of resisting Tiger fire, particularly on the Mark 7 variant. This made the Churchill unusually survivable compared to most Allied armor, but the Churchill's gun was a serious problem. The early Churchill Marks carried a 2-pounder, then a 6-pounder, both completely inadequate against Tiger armor. The 6-pounder could not penetrate the Tiger I's frontal armor at practical combat ranges. It was effective against the sides at close range, but that required getting close to a Tiger, which was a deeply dangerous proposition in a slow tank. The Churchill Mark 7 and the Churchill NA-75, which fitted an American 75mm gun, still fell short of what was needed against the Tiger's frontal armor. It was only when the Churchill was fitted with the 17-pounder in the A-43 Black Prince prototype development that it theoretically gained an adequate weapon, but this never entered widespread service. In practice, Churchill crews fighting Tigers relied on their armor for protection, used terrain aggressively, tried to work around to flanking positions, and depended on combined arms support more than direct gun contest. The Churchill was one of the few Allied tanks where the armor gave it a realistic chance of surviving a Tiger hit under certain conditions, which made it unusual in the Allied inventory. That survivability was a real tactical asset even when the gun lagged behind. The Cromwell was another British tank that appeared in quantity by 1944. Fast, well-designed mechanically, with good mobility, but armed initially with a 75mm gun that shared the Sherman's limitations against Tiger armor. Cromwell crews had to rely on the same flanking, terrain use, and range management that other Allied medium tank crews used. The Cromwell's speed was a genuine asset. Faster than the Tiger by a significant margin, it could attempt to close distance or escape from unfavorable engagements more reliably. But its armor, around 76mm on the front hull, still left it vulnerable to the Tiger's gun at combat distances. Later versions of the Cromwell line led to the Comet, which appeared in 1945, mounting a high-velocity 77mm gun that was a partial 17-pounder variant. The Comet could engage Tiger I armor more effectively, but it arrived very late in the war and saw limited Tiger combat as a result. The American tank destroyer arm deserves its own discussion because the United States, more than any other Allied nation, built specialized vehicles specifically to deal with heavily armored German tanks, and their performance against the Tiger tells a story of its own. The M10 Wolverine was the first significant American tank destroyer to see widespread service. It mounted a 76mm M7 gun in an open-top turret on an M4 Sherman hull. The 76mm M7 was a longer, more powerful gun than the standard Sherman 75mm, but it still struggled against Tiger I frontal armor at combat ranges. It was more effective than the 75mm against Tiger side armor at closer ranges, but it didn't solve the fundamental problem. The M10's open turret made the crew vulnerable to artillery and small arms fire, and its armor was lighter than the standard Sherman to save weight. Against Tigers, M10 crews relied on the same combined arms approach and terrain use that characterized all Allied engagements with heavy German tanks. What changed the game for American tank destroyers was the M36 Jackson, which mounted a 90mm M3 gun. The 90mm M3 could penetrate Tiger I frontal armor at combat ranges. At 914 meters, it could punch through approximately 122mm of armor, which exceeds the Tiger's 102mm frontal plate. With one FAP ammunition, the range extended further. The M36 entered service in late 1944 and gave American tank destroyer units their first genuine frontal answer to Tiger I armor. When M36 units encountered Tigers, they engaged with a degree of confidence that M10 units hadn't had. The combination of good mobility and an adequate gun made the M36 one of the more effective Tiger killers in the American inventory, though it still operated on open-top turret design that left crews exposed. The M18 Hellcat was something different entirely. The fastest tracked vehicle in American service during World War II, capable of speeds up to 60 miles per hour on roads. It mounted a 76mm gun, which shared the standard limitations against Tiger frontal armor. But its speed was extraordinary. The tactical theory behind the Hellcat was pure mobility. Don't try to out-armor the Tiger. Outrun it. Get to a flank. Get to a firing position the Tiger crew hasn't anticipated. Fire. Move before the Tiger can respond. In practice, this worked more often than might be expected, because Tigers in defensive positions were often operating with limited visibility and in terrain that restricted their own traverse speed. A Hellcat crew that used its speed intelligently could get to positions where its 76mm gun was effective, but it required aggressive, well-trained crews in favorable terrain. Against a Tiger in open ground with clear visibility, the Hellcat's speed advantage was less decisive. The gun still needed a side shot or a very close-range frontal engagement to achieve penetration. Let's talk about Canada now, because Canadian armored units fought extensively through Italy and Northwest Europe and faced Tigers in both theaters. Canadian forces largely operated Sherman tanks and used the same equipment as their British counterparts, including access to Fireflies. Canadian armor at the Falaise Gap in 1944 engaged Tigers that were part of the German forces trying to escape the encirclement. The terrain of the Normandy bocage and the later fighting through the Low Countries created specific conditions where tigers had less advantage than they did in the open desert of North Africa. Hedgerows, narrow roads, villages, and forests reduced engagement ranges, negated some of the tiger's long-range gun advantage, and created opportunities for flanking that didn't exist in open terrain. Canadian and British tankers learned to exploit this. Tactics evolved rapidly through the fighting in France. Not because the tanks got better guns overnight, but because crews learned how to use ground, how to work with infantry, how to set up positions that gave the Firefly a shot before the Tiger could identify and engage the troop. Now let's consider a tank that most people don't immediately think of when they list Tiger opponents. The M3 Stuart, the light tank that served with American, British, Commonwealth, and Soviet forces throughout the war. The Stuart mounted a 37mm gun and armor of around 38 to 51 millimeters. Against a Tiger I, this was not a fighting vehicle in any conventional sense. The 37mm gun could not penetrate Tiger armor at any practical range. The Tiger's 88 could destroy a Stuart at ranges that made the range seem almost abstract to the crews. Stuart crews that encountered Tigers were not in a combat situation. They were in a survival situation. Their only realistic options were to withdraw, use terrain to break line of sight, and call for anything with a larger gun. And yet Stuarts did fire at Tigers. Crews under fire, crews covering retreating infantry, crews caught with no escape route. These engagements happened. They almost universally ended badly for the Stuart. But the records show that Allied crews in inadequate vehicles sometimes chose to fight anyway, buying time for others, even when the equation was impossibly against them. The Matilda was a British infantry tank that served primarily in North Africa and the Pacific. Heavily armored for its time but slow in mounting, a 2-pounder gun that was already becoming obsolete by the time Tigers appeared. Against the Tiger, the Matilda had no answer. Its armor, around 78 millimeters on the front hull, might have resisted some Tiger hits under very specific conditions, but the gun was completely inadequate. The Valentine, another British infantry tank used in large numbers in North Africa and sent to the Soviets in significant quantities, faced similar issues. Later Valentines received a 6-pounder, but even this was insufficient against Tiger frontal armor. The Valentine's mobility and mechanical reliability were appreciated, but it was never a Tiger fighter. The Centaur and Cavalier, precursors to the Cromwell that saw limited frontline service, carried similar limitations. Their guns lagged behind the armor race with German heavy tanks, and they were gradually phased out or used in secondary roles. The A-13 cruiser tanks and the earlier British cruiser designs that served in the Western Desert Campaign in 1941 and 1942 technically precede the Tiger's appearance in North Africa by enough time that direct Tiger engagements were rare to non-existent. When the Tiger appeared in Tunisia in late 1942 and early 1943, these older designs were being replaced. But some units still equipped with older cruiser types may have encountered Tigers in Tunisia, and those engagements would have been severely one-sided. Now let's go somewhere that people rarely think to look. Let's look at improvised and adaptive solutions. Because the war produced situations where Tigers were killed not by purpose-built tank killers, but by creative use of whatever was available. There are documented cases of Tigers being destroyed by anti-tank guns firing from concealed positions, by aerial attack, by artillery, by infantry with anti-tank weapons, and occasionally by other tanks getting into positions they shouldn't have been able to reach. These aren't really tank versus tank engagements in the traditional sense, but they're part of the story of how the Tiger was countered. The British 17-pounder anti-tank gun, used in its towed form, could penetrate Tiger armor at combat ranges. A well-placed 17-pounder position could destroy a Tiger before the tank crew identified the threat. American 90mm anti-aircraft guns converted to anti-tank use did the same. Soviet 100mm and 122mm guns used in the anti-tank role were lethal to Tiger armor. These solutions remind us that the Tiger wasn't invincible. It was killable. It just often required the right weapon in the right position, and the Allies had to learn which weapons those were through painful trial and error. Let's now look at the bigger picture of the engagement record and try to understand what it actually tells us. The Tiger I was produced in relatively small numbers. Just over 1,300 were built between 1942 and 1944. Compare this to over 49,000 T-34s produced during the same rough period, or over 49,000 M4 Shermans built across the war. The production disparity is staggering, and it's fundamental to understanding why the Tiger's tactical superiority never translated into German strategic victory. Tigers broke down frequently. Their Maybach HL230 engine required careful handling. Transmission failures were common. The overlapping road wheel system that gave such a smooth ride also became impacted with mud and debris, and would freeze in extreme cold, sometimes immobilizing the tank entirely. Supplying them with fuel was a constant challenge as Allied air power increasingly attacked German supply lines. A Tiger that ran out of fuel or broke down was often a Tiger that was abandoned and destroyed by its own crew. When destroyed, Tiger wrecks were examined by Allied engineers. A significant proportion showed evidence of crew-initiated destruction, tanks blown up by their own crews to prevent capture. This tells you something important. Many Tiger losses were not the result of being knocked out by Allied tank guns. They were the result of mechanical failure, supply failure, or tactical encirclement that made escape impossible. This doesn't diminish the Tiger's capability as a weapon. It means understanding its defeat requires looking at the whole system, not just the gun versus armor equation. In pure tank versus tank combat, Tigers had kill ratios that were genuinely impressive. Small numbers of Tigers destroyed large numbers of Allied tanks in specific engagements. Michael Wittmann's engagement at Villers-Bocage in June 1944 is the most famous example, where a small number of Tiger tanks, with Wittmann's Tiger at the forefront, destroyed a significant number of British vehicles in a single engagement. But the tactical situation that created that opportunity, a British armored column on a road in Bocage terrain with limited ability to react, was as responsible for the outcome as the Tiger's firepower. Put those same Tigers in a different situation, with adequate warning, with Allied tanks in proper tactical formation using ground, with Fireflies ready, and the outcome changes. The Tiger's reputation was built partly on real performance and partly on the conditions in which it most often achieved its best results. It excelled when it had the initiative, when it was in a prepared defensive position, when engagement ranges were long and terrain was open. It was more vulnerable when it was forced to move, when it was caught in close country, when it faced enemies who had solved the approach and the gun problems simultaneously. Let's now address the central question directly. Which Allied tank had the best consistent chance of winning against a Tiger I? To answer this properly, we need to define what consistent chance means. It doesn't mean guaranteed victory. No tank had that. It doesn't mean the Tiger couldn't win the engagement. It means a tank that, when properly employed by a trained crew in realistic combat conditions, had the mechanical and ballistic capability to engage the Tiger I at practical combat ranges, achieve penetration of its armor, and survive long enough to do so with a frequency that can't be dismissed as exceptional luck or extreme circumstances. With that definition in place, the answer becomes clearer. The Sherman Firefly stands as the most consistent Allied answer to the Tiger I across the main theaters where it operated. Here is why. Argument by argument. The 17-pounder gun gave the Firefly the ability to penetrate Tiger I frontal armor at 1,000 meters with standard AP ammunition. This is the fundamental baseline. Without reliable frontal penetration at practical combat range, no tank can be said to have a consistent chance. Every other Allied tank either couldn't achieve this at all, could only achieve it at dangerously close range, or required HVAP ammunition that was often unavailable in the quantities needed. The Firefly could do it with its standard combat load. The Firefly was mounted on a proven, reliable platform. The Sherman's mechanical reliability was one of its most important traits in the context of a prolonged campaign. A tank that is reliable enough to be where it needs to be, in the right position, with fuel and ammunition, at the right moment, is more likely to get the shot than a faster or more powerful vehicle that is in a repair depot or out of fuel. The Firefly was maintained by the same logistics infrastructure supporting all Sherman-equipped units, which was substantial. The Firefly's visual similarity to the standard Sherman gave it a tactical advantage in identification. German crews were trained to identify threats and neutralize them in order of danger. A Firefly that looked like a standard Sherman, in the first moments of an engagement, had a window, however brief, in which the Tiger crew might prioritize differently. This disguise factor is subtle, but real, and multiple accounts from both Allied and German tank crews confirm that it influenced engagements. The Firefly operated within integrated combined arms units. It wasn't fighting alone. One Firefly per troop of 4 Shermans meant the Firefly always had supporting vehicles drawing fire, screening its approach, and engaging enemy infantry. This context matters enormously. A Tiger crew dealing with multiple Sherman threats, infantry, artillery, and air observation, is a Tiger crew with divided attention. The Firefly was designed for exactly this kind of combined engagement. The Firefly had a track record in actual combat. it destroyed Tigers. Not in theoretical ballistic tests or proving ground trials, but in Normandy hedgerows, in the Netherlands, in Germany itself. There are documented engagements where Fireflies engaged and destroyed Tigers. Some were destroyed in turn. The equation was never one-sided. But the Firefly gave crews a genuine, repeatable, documented path to winning, which is exactly what the definition of consistent chance requires. The Firefly's weaknesses were real and shouldn't be minimized. It was never available in sufficient numbers. The ratio of 1 per troop meant Allied units went into battle, knowing most of their tanks still had inadequate weapons. The Firefly's modified turret reduced some internal functionality and crew ergonomics. Its hull was still Sherman armor, still vulnerable to the Tiger's gun. Getting into effective range was still dangerous, still required skill, and sometimes luck. And the Germans, once they understood the threat, specifically targeted Fireflies, assigning them priority kill status. But the question isn't which Allied tank was invulnerable to the Tiger. None of them were. The question is, which one gave its crew the most consistent chance of winning? And the Firefly's combination of gun power, platform reliability, tactical integration, and combat track record puts it at the top of that list. The M36 Jackson comes closest to a secondary answer for American forces, with its 90mm gun, genuinely threatening Tiger frontal armor, and a mobility profile that allowed tactical positioning. Late-war M36 units with HVAP ammunition could engage Tigers frontally at combat ranges with real expectation of penetration. But the M36's open-top turret and its role as a dedicated tank destroyer rather than a main battle tank limited its tactical integration in ways the Firefly didn't face. The T-34-85 and the IS-2 represent the Soviet answer, and in the context of the Eastern Front, where mass, terrain, and attrition were the defining factors, they were effective. The T-34-85 gave Soviet crews a realistic chance at ranges below 1,000 meters against Tiger frontal armor, and more reliable penetration at the sides. The IS-2's massive gun could destroy a Tiger at range, though its rate of fire and separate loading system created vulnerabilities in close engagements. For the Eastern Front specifically, the T-34-85 arguably had the most practical impact simply because of the numbers in which it operated. But the Firefly's gun performance against Tiger frontal armor was more consistently reliable at a wider range of combat distances. Let's talk about something that the ballistic tables don't capture, because equipment is only part of the story. Crew quality and training varied enormously across every Allied force, and in the German force as well. A Tiger crewed by experienced veterans was a fundamentally different threat than a Tiger crewed by men rushed through training as the war's tide turned against Germany. Equally, an Allied tank crew that had been through combat, that had learned from survival, that had developed the instincts for using terrain and choosing positions, was far more likely to get value from their equipment than a replacement crew fresh from training. The Firefly's advantage was not just mechanical. It required a crew that understood its role, that knew when to hold back and let the standard Shermans draw fire, that could identify when the geometry of an engagement offered a viable shot, and that had the nerve to take it knowing the Tiger crew would target them specifically once the shot gave their position away. Firefly commanders who survived did so by combining their gun's capability with tactical thinking that went beyond simply having the right weapon. They used dead ground. They fired from hull-down positions whenever terrain allowed, exposing only the turret. They moved after each shot to deny the enemy a stationary target. They coordinated with their troops so that the standard Shermans were creating pressure while the Firefly set up the shot. This kind of integrated thinking was what made the Firefly effective in practice, not just on paper. The same applies to every Allied tank we've discussed. A well-trained Sherman crew with a 76mm gun, using smoke and terrain intelligently, attacking the flank in built-up terrain, had a better chance than their ballistic tables might suggest. A poorly trained Firefly crew that presented itself at long range and open ground against an experienced Tiger crew had a worse chance than their guns' capability should have allowed. War doesn't work purely on paper. But when we assess consistent chance, we have to look at what a trained crew in a typical combat situation could achieve, and across that standard, the Firefly stood above its peers. There is another dimension to this story that's worth examining, and that's the evolution of Allied tactical thinking specifically in response to the Tiger threat. Early Allied encounters with Tigers in Tunisia were, for the most part, disorganized and reactive. Units stumbled into engagements they weren't prepared for, with equipment that couldn't handle the threat, using tactics designed for fighting different German tanks. The result was a series of sharp, painful lessons that reshaped Allied armor doctrine. By the time of the Normandy landings in June 1944, Allied armored forces had incorporated those lessons. Tanks operated in closer coordination with infantry. Artillery was more aggressively